Hi class! This week we are going to be talking about civil rights and civil liberties. We're starting a unit 2, about these things, civil rights and civil liberties. So this week is kind of foundational knowledge in these areas. This week we're going to do something a little different than we did in quarter 1. I'm going to start out with a lecture, and you should be taking notes during this lecture. Hopefully I've already spoken to you about that. If not, please pull out your notes and start taking them. First, we'll get started with civil rights. Civil rights are the rights that you have to receive equal treatment and be fair, for things and judgments to be fair, make sure that you aren't discriminated against based on a certain set of characteristics in certain situations. So, for example, in receiving an education, in receiving a job, in getting housing, or any kind of public accommodations. There are certain things that you will need to know very specifically. For example, the protected characteristics, so the things that people cannot discriminate against include race, color, national origin, religion, gender, disability, age, and citizenship status. So race is your kind of ethnic group. So whether you're black or Latino or white, all races have to be treated equally in those settings. Color is more of like this perceived race. So if someone is perceiving that you are black, even though you're Latino, that could be a characteristic that would be determined as color. National origin, so wherever you were born, kind of relates to the same thing as citizenship status. So, for example, if you are a permanent resident versus whether you're a citizen, they cannot deny you certain rights based on those things. Your religion, your gender, your disability. So, for example, if you wear glasses and I say, everyone who wears glasses has to sit on the left side of the room because you need to see the board better. Well, that might give someone who doesn't have glasses less of an ability to see the board. An age, for example, I can't deny someone who is 60 years old housing because they may die sooner, whatever it might be. Those are the protected characteristics that will help people kind of be insulated from discrimination. However, you'll note that there are some characteristics that are not included. Namely, currently a hot issue is sexuality. So, for example, if someone is considered a homosexual and they are not given a job, there is no legal basis right now for them to seek damages. There's no way for them to say that it is a civil rights violation because they're not considered a protected characteristic. However, if they can prove that they were denied that job because of any of these other characteristics, race, color, national origin, religion, gender, disability, age, or citizenship status, then they would have the right to file a complaint for a civil rights violation. Okay? Typically, that comes in the form of damages, which is monetary value. Okay? The second part is civil liberties, and these are the rights that are guaranteed based on the laws. In the U.S., the main kind of place where we look for those rights and the civil liberties that are granted to us are the first 10 amendments, or the Bill of Rights. For example, the First Amendment says, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion, or prohibiting the free exercise of, or abridging the freedom of speech or of the press, or the right of the people peacefully to assemble and to petition the government for a redress of grievances. Basically, this means you can't, as the United States government, have a formal religion. You can't make sure that other people are not practicing other religions. You can't take away people's freedom to speak or freedom to print and publish their thoughts. You can't take away people's right to peacefully assemble. That mainly kind of means the idea to protest or to meet and gather, or the idea that we can't take away the right for people to petition the government for redress of grievances, which what that means is the US government can't stop us as people from saying, hey, government, you've done all of these things badly. Here's how you need to fix them. Okay, so we can't basically be stopped from giving them a list of all the things we think they've done wrong. Okay. The big difference between these two things are civil rights are protections for people, for certain people. So to be protected from unfair treatment. Whereas civil liberties are the things that we are allowed to do as citizens or residents of this country. So we're allowed to speak our minds, we're allowed to assemble as long as we have the proper permits, we're allowed to do those kinds of things. And we'll talk about some of the limitations of those civil rights and civil liberties later on. But mainly the difference is civil rights are protections surrounding the civil liberties. Okay, so we have these rights, and those are our liberties that have been given to us. And in order to protect those liberties that have been given to us, we have civil rights to ensure that we are all granted this equal protection under the law. So how do these rights or liberties exist in practice? So in civil rights, you typically see issues in education, employment, housing, or public accommodations. So in education, you're talking about things like districts in my home state. The school district that I lived in was very wealthy, which meant that the high schools were very, very nice. One town over in Lancaster, you had very, very poor communities where students did not necessarily have the funds to have good books and those kinds of things. If the people in Lancaster decided to get together and sue the state of South Carolina, saying that this was a civil rights violation because they're poor, if they could make an argument that they were a part of a protected, if they could make the argument that they were part of protected characteristic group, and the reason that they were placed in those kinds of school districts was based on race, color, national origin, religion, gender, disability, age, or citizenship status, then they could potentially have a lawsuit. So for example, if Lancaster was filled with a majority population of African Americans, and they said that the reason that Lancaster did not get as much money in that county for education as we did in ours, they might have a reason to believe that there was a civil rights violation. The same can go in employment. If they have two equally qualified candidates and one of them is white and one of them is Latino, if the white person is hired and the Latino believes that the reason they were not hired is because of their race or color, then they too could file a lawsuit. The same goes for housing. If you have a person applying for a new apartment building and they are 75 and there's a person applying for that same apartment building and they are 25, if the apartment building is trying to find younger people to get into their building to make it more up and coming, that would be a civil rights violation. Okay, public accommodations has to do with mainly this is an issue for those with disabilities. So for example, if I'm going into a public space and it does not have ramp accessibility for wheelchairs, those things would be civil rights violations, okay, because it is a protected characteristic. I have a disability and you must ensure that I'm still able to enjoy those things that all other people are. Okay. How do we protect these rights, or how should we protect these rights? The rule of thumb that I was taught in law school is your rights end where someone else's begin. Okay, so I have the freedom of speech. I can say whatever I want to say as long as what I'm saying does not impact or is not harmful to other people. So if I say that New Heights is embezzling money, okay, for example, if that is proven true, then I am not impacting the rights of others because they were committing a crime, okay? However, if that is proven untrue and I'm just saying things to get people in trouble, then they would have a right to basically sue me for slander, for saying things that are untrue. However, the way that the United States government protects these rights is something that has long been kind of a question of debate. Okay, so how should the United States government look at these rights? How do they view these rights? How do we protect them? The liberties that you are granted, how do we ensure that those things are protected? So, for example, in class we've talked quite a bit about gun control and the idea that the Second Amendment gives you the right to bear arms, but should we add in different stipulations to that? Like, is there need to be a mental health stipulation where you have to pass mental health tests in order to get a gun? Well, this is an idea of like, are we then protecting the rights, or should we protect the rights of the mentally ill, which is a disability, and why should we protect those rights, or should there be limitations on the liberties that we give? I don't have an answer to this. This is something that we definitely will be discussing further, but it's something that you need to be thinking about. Like, how do we, as the U.S. government, how do we protect rights? How should we protect rights? When it comes to civil rights, I want to make sure that we are making a big distinction between civil rights and the civil rights movement. The civil rights movement took place in the 50s and 60s, and to a certain extent still continues today in smaller circles. But when we talk about civil rights in this class, we are not just talking about the civil rights movement. The civil rights movement is one small portion of civil rights, okay? The civil rights movement looked at African Americans being denied equal protection in education and in voting rights, mainly, okay? And in public spaces, right? The fact that they had to use a separate water fountain than whites. Those kinds of things they were looking out for. However, the civil rights in terms of the United States government involve so much more. So, for example, when we talk about voting, and we're looking at civil rights, at the beginning of the United States government in 1787, you're talking about only white men over 21 can vote. Almost 100 years later, they ratified the 15th Amendment, and you couldn't deny the vote to anyone based on race, which basically meant that you could not allow former slaves or slaves, or they weren't slaves at that point, but former slaves or blacks the right to vote, okay? In 50 years later, they ratified the 19th Amendment, and women were allowed to vote. And then about 50 years after that, they gave the right to vote to 18 to 20-year-olds in the 26th Amendment. So you can kind of see how civil rights has shifted and changed over time. Originally, it was just white men. It moved to black men. Then it moved to women. And then it moved to 18-year-olds plus. So you can kind of see how that doesn't just talk about the civil rights movement, which happened in the 50s and 60s, the 1950s and 60s, but it talks about throughout our government how that definition of what civil rights is has shifted and evolved.